right, welcome to our 16th Annual Lake Association Summit. My name is Lauren Dye, and I'm going to be your MC for this event. Let's review a few housekeeping notes related to Zoom, although I'm sure you all have heard them all before. First, you're all going to be muted during the presentations, and I am going to encourage that you use the chat box to ask any questions. However, if you would like to ask your question in person, please use the raise my hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and I will call and unmute you so that you can ask your questions during the question time period. So we had over 60 people register for this event, and I know people are still filtering in, but we're not going to be able to do individual introductions. However, from what I can tell from the reservations, I believe the following lake associations are represented: the Mullet Area Preservation Society, Twin Lakes Association, Douglas Lake Improvement Association, Three Lakes Association, Elk-Skegumog Lakes Association, Lake Charlevoix Association, Long Lake Association, Larks Lake Association, Birch Lake Association, Walloon Lake Association, Black Lake Preservation Society, and the Intermediate Lake Association. So if I missed anyone, please drop the name of your lake association in the chat so that we can recognize you. There, you will notice on the agenda that there are no scheduled breaks because we have a lot of great presentations lined up and we want to make sure that we get through them all. So please take breaks as needed. The summit is being recorded, and we will be sure to make sure that link is available to you once we have it all set to go. Next, I would like the Watershed Council staff who are joining us today. We don't have everyone today, but those that are, I would like you to introduce yourselves real quickly because we do have a few new faces. So Gail.
I'm Gail Grunwald. I'm the Executive Director of the Watershed Council.
Okay. Jen DeMoss.
Hi there, I'm Jen DeMoss. I'm the Communications Director for the Watershed Council.
Jen Buchanan.
Morning, everybody. I'm Jen Buchanan. I'm the Associate Director with the Watershed Council.
Caroline.
Good morning. My name is Caroline Keeson. I'm the Monitoring Programs Coordinator at the Watershed Council.
Kate.
I'm Kate Sweikel, and I'm the Communications and Development Specialist.
Okay. And Casey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Cook, and I'm the new Policy and Advocacy Specialist with the Watershed Council.
Great, thank you. Is there anyone else from the Watershed Council that I missed? Okay. All right. Next, I would like to introduce our Executive Director, Gail Grunwald. Gail will be retiring at the end of this year with an impressive 37 years of service, and we really appreciate your dedication. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Gail, for our welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. As I already introduced myself, Gail Grunwald, the Executive Director. I'm retiring at the end of the year, so this is my last Lake Association Summit. And I have a very, very short introduction PowerPoint. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Watershed Council, I thought it'd be good to just sort of set the stage, and Jen DeMoss is going to share her screen and put us all off to the side so you don't have to be looking at our faces the whole time. Anyway, as we've said, 16th Annual Lake Association Summit, which is fabulous run. We've had the last couple virtually, and we're really hoping next year that we will be in person. But for now, here we are again in the virtual format. So welcome and thanks for coming. Next slide, actually. Whoop. Here it goes. Oh, she's got it. So we always start these meetings with a discussion about the Watershed Council's mission. And this is on our website as well. We really do stick to our mission. We believe in our mission. We have an optimistic, positive mission. We really do expect that we can empower others and make a positive difference. And through that means, we do it through advocacy, education, water quality monitoring, research, and restoration actions. So next slide. Our service area, our little faces are across the side of all of those numbers. So hopefully you can read some of this, but what a fabulous and incredible service area of water resources. So, you can see that it does not stick to county lines. Our service area is the watersheds of the major lakes in Antrim, Charlevoix, Sheboygan, and Emmett counties. So you can see those color-coded, the major watersheds, the largest in terms of surface area being the Sheboygan River watershed, which starts literally right on the other side of Petoskey and goes all the way into Lake Huron. So we really do like to have people pay attention to their watersheds. We work on a watershed basis. Our watershed management planning and implementation is the cornerstone of the work that we do in an effort to both preserve and also protect and restore those resources. Next one. A little education about what a watershed is. It's the land surface that drains to a particular water body. And so when we are focusing on working in a watershed, we're also educating about the watershed itself and how each of our actions, as well as the actions of local governments, impacts that body of water through the runoff that's running across from septics, wells, groundwater discharge, urban runoff into the water body. Next one. How do we do it? We do it through science, advocacy, education, and restoration. This is a picture across all of those efforts, both with our volunteer science folks. They are identifying actually macroinvertebrates off to the left. Policy, we go to Washington and Lansing and local governments to emphasize improved policy on all levels, and then education of both school-aged children, which is what this picture is, along with adult education through our public speaking efforts. Next one. Here's science. We not only do this monitoring research ourselves as a staff, but we rely on a large number of volunteers to do both lake monitoring as well as stream monitoring and avian botulism monitoring. Those programs are managed by Caroline Keeson. Next one. And then advocacy, not just policy, but also advocacy. So we both look at local ordinances and state and federal ordinances, but we look at the issues and the impacts from land use and other activities that impact water resources. And we try to influence in a positive way what individuals and local governments are doing. So our advocacy program is actually quite broad. And the one on the far right, you can see Jennifer McKay in Washington, D.C. Next one. Education. So these are primarily school-aged education photos. And that is run by Eli Baker, our Water Resource Education Coordinator. The Watershed Academy, programs within schools related to watershed science, and then also the use of actually scientific exploration tools off to the right. Next, and I think it's the final one. Yeah, so just another thank you for attending. We have so many ways for you to follow our work, both on our website, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube videos. So if there's anything you want to learn about the Watershed Council, we have the way for you to do it. And also events like today. So thanks for attending. I hope it's a meaningful opportunity for you to learn more about what we're doing. I'll be participating in one of the breakout sessions, and the rest of the staff is available too for any questions you might have. So thank you for attending.
All right, thank you, Gail. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter while he shares his screen. So Dr. Joe Noener works for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources in the Fishery Division's Habitat Management Unit. He coordinates the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, which conducts research, education, and outreach and conservation projects to understand and benefit fish habitat in the inland lakes of the upper Midwest. He also serves as the inland lake habitat expert for the DNR, which includes developing statewide inland lake habitat guidance on issues like large woody debris restoration, aquatic nuisance control, watershed management, and climate change. Joe serves as the Fishery Division's lead on climate change, its liaison to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and its representative to numerous partnerships focused on inland lakes management throughout the state. All right, take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Lauren. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. That's how every Zoom presentation starts. Can you hear me okay? Can you see my screen? So thank you. And thank you to everybody who's attending today. This is a really great opportunity to talk about fish and the environments that they live in, but not just that, to talk about how we can work to conserve and be stewards for our lakes, you know, in the broader perspective. So I'm excited to talk about my individual piece, and I'll be also participating in the rest of the sessions and looking forward to the conversations that come out of it. So today I'll be talking about making the connection between fish and flora, the plants in our lakes. And I'm going to talk about fish, but I'm also going to talk about how those fish are connected to the ecosystem. And really, we need to be thinking about our lakes as an entire ecosystem that's all interdependent. You can't just think about fish, you can't just think about plants. It all has to come together. So with that said, I will get started here. All right. So to set the stage, I think the first thing that we need to think about really is, why do we even care about our lakes? And I think I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but I'll lay it out anyway and perhaps remind us of why other people should care about lakes as much as we do. So lakes provide food. You may not think about it, but consumption of fish on inland lakes in Michigan is likely on par with the typical American's total fish consumption. So if you went to somebody in Kansas and asked them, that average person, how much fish do they eat in a given year? That's probably the same amount as the amount of fish that a Michigander is eating just from inland lakes in a year. So it's a big part of our diets. Inland lakes provide water. Some of them provide water supplies for drinking water and other uses. Of course, they provide habitat for fish and wildlife, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And they provide tourism and recreation. So 48% of angling trips in Michigan are on inland lakes. We often talk about our state as the Great Lakes state. And of course, it is amazing that we have 4 of the 5 Great Lakes touching Michigan. But I think it's pretty important for us to remember that most of the angling effort, the majority of the angling effort is on inland lakes as opposed to rivers or Great Lakes. And that angling effort across the state is valued at about $4.2 billion when you bring in all of the sales for fishing tackle and equipment, all of the hotel nights that folks have to stay, and the food that they have to buy, and all of those other pieces that go along with angling. So tourism and fisheries specifically are a big part of Michigan's economy and culture. And then of course, lakes provide a spiritual and symbolic value and a sense of place. I think I'm probably again preaching to the choir with this particular group when we talk about the value of being up north and spending time in the outdoors on a beautiful lake. There's just something that you can't put a dollar value to, you can't easily quantify, but it's part of the character of and the identity of the state of Michigan and Michiganders. And so taking care of those lakes then is also part of that that stewardship that we feel for that sense of place. And of course, again, as lakefront property owners, you're probably keenly aware that lakefront properties are expensive. So they provide high value real estate, and that's especially important for county governments and other townships, et cetera, because they provide property taxes that provide the base for a lot of the community services. So inland lakes are really critical to our way of life in Michigan and to our identity. And I've been asked to come and talk today about aquatic plant management. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of what aquatic plant management looks like in the state of Michigan, but I'm not going to go too far into depth because we have some excellent speakers from Eagle later in the morning that are going to go much farther in depth. So I'm just going to give a thumbnail to set the stage here and provide the context for the rest of my presentation. So the last time that we did a really good survey of what's happening in terms of aquatic plant management in Michigan, we pulled data from 2016, and actually Ryan Crouch pulled these data together, and he'll be presenting later. And using that, we estimated that 19,000 lake acres in Michigan were treated for aquatic vegetation. So if you're like me, you might need to try to get a sense for what does that mean, 19,000 acres? That's 14,000 football fields. And it's about 30 miles squared. So a pretty substantial amount of Michigan's lakes are being treated for aquatic plants. Aquatic plant management generally falls into two categories: plant management for nuisance species that lake users and riparians maybe just don't like. They're in the way, but they're native. And then there's invasive species, and those are species that are non-native, so they're not typically found in that water body prior to their establishment from some other place, and they cause harm. So for invasive species, about 7,000 lake acres were treated only for invasive species. And then about 11,000 acres were treated for invasive species and native nuisance species, according to the permits. So we see a mix, but we do see that a pretty good chunk, over half of, probably 2/3 of our plant management does include the potential for treatments for native species that people identify as a nuisance. And 90% of the lakes that are treated have treatments that are less than 40% of the total lake surface area. So most aquatic plant treatments are treating a small proportion of the lake. About 6% of treated lakes have treatments that are 60% or more of the total lake surface area. Now that's an enormous amount of treatment, and it's a fairly small but still present proportion of lakes. And then we have 10 lakes in 2016 that received whole lake fluoridone treatments. So these are treatments that have very significant effects on the aquatic plants throughout the lake. Now, if you're like me, probably your interaction with aquatic plants comes from something like this, where you're out fishing on a boat and you feel a tug on the end of your line and you have that feel of excitement, and oh, it's just weeds. And I can't tell you how many times I've said that. It's just weeds. And we engage with the lakes that we're using, especially if we're an angler, and we come across these aquatic plants, and we have these repetitive interactions where they're frustrating, and it can be easy to give them a bad name. So I want to talk today a little bit about what the value is, what their role is in the ecosystem. And I think I'll start off first by saying the reason that I often catch just weeds when I'm fishing is because I'm fishing where the fish are, and the fish are in those plants. So they're not, if you're fishing where there's not aquatic plants, often you're not catching fish, at least for fish like largemouth bass and others. So I'm going to get a little bit complicated here, and I dusted off this graph. This is really from some of the seminal work on aquatic plant management and limnology. And Sheffer proposed that aquatic plants, which you see, hopefully you can see my pointer here in the middle, they're right in the middle here, vegetation. And I'm not going to ask you to try to memorize this diagram. I'm not even going to try to explain it. What I want you to take away from this diagram, because I think this is the most important diagram I'll show today, is that these aquatic plants are connected to everything else in the lake. They influence waves. They're influenced by water depth. They affect the nutrients in the lake. They're affected by the turbidity in the lake and the water clarity. And they affect the way that fish and zooplankton interact and their populations. And all of those come back and affect turbidity, the water clarity, and the suspension of sediments in the lake. So you don't have to, again, memorize this entire figure, but what I would like you to take away from it is that aquatic plants are really the linchpin of the lake, and they can have an enormous effect, an outsized effect on what is happening within the lake. So that was a fairly scientific explanation, but I want to give a more anecdotal explanation. So what I'm going to show you here is video from an electrofishing survey. And electrofishing surveys, I'm just going to go ahead and roll it. Electrofishing surveys are conducted by the Department of Natural Resources and other researchers. We use a boat with electricity. So there's an electric current between these booms at the front of the boat and the folks that are standing here with nets. What I want you to notice is, as we started with our electrofishing run, we were driving over an area without aquatic vegetation, and we weren't catching anything. And now all of a sudden, we've come up to this area with aquatic vegetation. You see lily pads, bulrushes, and other plants, and all of a sudden, our netters are getting very active, very busy. And that's because there's aquatic plants that are providing those habitats for fish to hide and do all the things that fish do: grow, eat, avoid predators, all of those things. So, you know, it's sometimes easy to just look at a graph and to dismiss it or to not be able to really conceptualize what it means. But for me, looking at and watching this video where you see, you know, some bored netters at the very beginning when there's no plants, and then all of a sudden they get very, very busy catching lots and lots of largemouth once you get into the plants, it hammers it home in a different way. And so I find that intuitive. Okay. Go to my next slide here. So because of that really important interaction between aquatic plants and fish and the whole ecosystem, the littoral zones of lakes were designated as a priority for Michigan's Wildlife Action Plan. In our Wildlife Action Plan, we identified a number of different habitat types, aquatic habitat types in Great Lakes and streams and inland lakes that we really wanted to prioritize to make sure that we protect these areas to protect our critical ecosystem functions and species that really need our help. And so these shallow area zones of lakes, which we call littoral zones, these are the areas where aquatic plants live. And this is why they're a focus of the Wildlife Action Plan. So there are a number of species that are using these plants, not just fish, but you know, you've got things like Blanchard's cricket frog and the pug-nosed shiner, which are state endangered species. You've got more common fit species like muskrat and bluegill, largemouth bass, mallards, and painted turtles that we probably all have some experience of seeing and interacting with in and around aquatic plants. Their populations are pretty good, but these are the kind of charismatic species that we think about seeing all the time on our lakes. And then we have other species that are sort of on the cusp. Starhead top minnow, for example, is a species of concern. And so if aquatic plants and shoreline habitats are degraded further, then we expect that those starhead top minnows are going to experience declines and become threatened or endangered as well. So there's a host of species, from the common ones that we fish for and have a lot of experience with to the uncommon ones, all of which really benefit from these aquatic plants. And so they're a focus for the DNR as we comment on permit applications and as we talk with folks about how to best manage their lakes for the aquatic resources. And just to sort of emphasize that again, here's a very small partial list of fish and their affinity for plants. Along the left-hand side, you've got just a list of common fish that you typically see in Michigan lakes, except for shad. And then you see their life history stages. So when they're larvae, when they're little babies, when they're juveniles, so when they've started to grow and swim around a little bit more, when they're adults, when they're old enough to spawn, and then their relationship to those aquatic plants when they're spawning, so when they're reproducing, when they're foraging, if they're finding food, or if they're avoiding predators. And what you see is, you know, big picture, almost all of the main species that you think about in Michigan lakes when you think about catching fish are using aquatic plants at some point of their lives. And so again, it's really critical that these plants exist for these species to use throughout their lives. I'll go into a little bit more detail just on an example. So here's one way that aquatic plants can affect fish. They can affect their reproduction. So on the left-hand side, you've got a plot of how much aquatic vegetation was in a trial in this study. And this is just an index. I wouldn't try to make sense of how much aquatic vegetation this is, but the important thing to note is that as there's more aquatic vegetation, there's a greater proportion of yellow perch larvae detected. So the yellow perch larvae are living where there's aquatic plants. And that makes sense because yellow perch lay their eggs in these big egg masses that are deposited on structures like aquatic plants or large woody habitat, like down trees that fall in the lake. And they need those to suspend them off the bottom and provide the oxygen that allows them to hatch and grow. So it's very clear that aquatic vegetation is providing improved reproduction for fish like yellow perch and others. Aquatic plants also provide refuge and recruitment. So recruitment is a fisheries term for measuring how much reproduction you get and that reproduction coming into the fishery for adults. And numerous studies have shown this. So way back in 1992, some of the first studies looking at species diversities and richness relative to aquatic plants, which are also referred to as macrophytes, found that abundance and species richness were greatest in areas with aquatic plants. And again, as a juvenile fish, it makes sense that aquatic plants are producing this abundance and species richness because it's an integral part of their life history. Here you've got a muskellunge at about 1 centimeter, 1.5 centimeters long. And it uses its coloration to camouflage itself within an aquatic plant bed. Similarly, you've got in this bed of lily pads, you probably can't see it, but here are 2 fish that are hiding within the plant bed. And I bet if I hadn't circled those in yellow, it would have taken you a fair amount of time to spot both of those. And that's the point. They're able to hide from predators. We know that fish grow and feed better in aquatic plants. So again, northern pike, bluegill, pumpkin seed, individual size and population biomass increase with more aquatic plants. And I've done research in Michigan that shows that if you put largemouth bass in cages like these in a lake, one with no plants, one with some plants, and one with a lot of plants, if they're in the one with a lot of plants, they grow faster and they eat more and they eat better when they're in those habitats with aquatic plants. So we've got really strong evidence that these aquatic plants are important for the way fish complete their life cycles and ultimately for their populations. I mentioned though that aquatic plants aren't just important for fish, they're also important for the entire lake ecosystem. And so I'm gonna step through a figure that explains a really important concept in lake management. And this is related to water quality. So we'll start really simple. Imagine you have a lake and you have lakes on a spectrum from low nutrients on the left to high nutrients on the right. And if you have low nutrients, you have maybe a blue or very clear color of the lake. There aren't a lot of aquatic plants, but there are some. And as that lake has more and more nutrients in it, it has more phytoplankton. So the algae that live in the water column are going to make that water less clear and greener. And then there are going to be more rooted aquatic plants. and ultimately then on the high end of the spectrum, you're going to have a fairly green lake, and you're going to have lots of aquatic plants. Well, let's think about how that affects water quality. Again, as you have more nutrients, you're going to have increasing turbidity. So turbidity is the amount of stuff in the water that's making it difficult to see through the water. That's not a scientific definition, but I'm trying to simplify it here. And so that turbidity then is increasing with the level of nutrients in the lake. But let's say that we remove all of the aquatic plants in the lake. Now, all of those nutrients have to go somewhere. And if those plants aren't taking them out of the lake, then they're going to go out of the lake water column, then they're going to go to the zooplankton and to the phytoplankton in the lake. So those algae, they're floating around in the water column. And so for the same amount of nutrients, then you're going to have a relatively higher production within the water column from those phytoplankton, and you're going to have a relatively greener lake. So, even on this high end of the spectrum, if you've got high nutrients, these plants would normally be taking out some of those nutrients from the water column, and in the lake where there's no plants, they're not able to do that. And so you have even more turbidity, even greater production from those phytoplankton. And that's just shown by this other line here, this orange line representing a state with no plants. And what Sheffer laid out for us in his seminal work and what has been shown in subsequent papers is that really there's these kind of two stable states that the lake tends to be in. If there are plants or if there aren't plants, and that the lake tends toward those. Those are sort of equilibrium that the lake's going to gravitate toward. But if you're going up with nutrients, you can get to a point where aquatic plants are no longer able to thrive in the lake because the water quality has declined. And at that point, then you flip over into this state of a lake without vegetation. And that is acts as if there was a large nutrient addition to the lake because there are more nutrients in the water column and has results for water quality. And it can be then very difficult to flip it back into the clear state where there are aquatic plants. And the same goes for aquatic plant treatments that remove too many aquatic plants. If you really knocked back this aquatic plant population, you can flip the lake into a state with of low clarity and low vegetation. So this is something to consider. It's really important and especially pertinent in shallow lakes. In those large, deep lakes, this isn't as big of a factor, but for shallow, small lakes, this is a really important piece to consider. And plants play this role in all lakes, but it's not as much of a deciding factor in the water quality for those big lakes, big deep lakes. And then shoreline erosion, plants provide the same benefits as the windrows you see on farmers' fields. They prevent erosion. So I've got a little video here that shows. Turn the sound off. As waves come in along the shoreline, the plants intercept them and they decrease the energy of the waves, so that by the time the wave hits the shoreline, there's not much wave energy, and so that minimizes erosion. And what we see then is that that reduced erosion has benefits for water quality. Again, here's a study in Marsh Lake in Wisconsin, and they did a manipulation where they removed the plants from the lake, and then they looked at before they removed the plants and after they removed the plants, what the phosphorus levels were in the lake. And again, those phosphorus levels indicate the growth, the potential for growth of phytoplankton that decrease water quality. And what they found was that in circumstances where there were no plants in the lake, when there were high winds, that erosion really kicked up and released a lot of phosphorus into the lake from shoreline erosion and from shallow water erosion. There were plants, those high wind events didn't have the same results in terms of lake nutrient inputs. So important to consider how removing plants affects lake water quality. And then of course, plants, aquatic plants help us to provide a more resilient ecosystem against future invasive species. So we want to make sure, I want to make sure to clarify at the beginning, I mentioned that, really we've got native plants and we've got invasive plants. And the key for invasive plants is to prevent their establishment. They can outcompete and take over in some cases. And so management is necessary. And I don't want to make it sound like management of invasive plants is something we shouldn't be doing, because there are trade-offs in all lake management. We need to minimize the invasives and try to knock them back as best as we can. But what I'd like to really argue for here is that management should limit its effects on native plants. And those native plants are really important for the lake ecosystem health. And so that's the part that we as stewards of our lakes really need to try to make sure that we can keep an eye on. So I'll wrap up here. I know I've got just a few minutes left. Just the main take home, these native plants are a key part of our ecosystems for lakes, and they're the linchpin of those lakes. Removing those native plants can increase nutrients, it decreases water quality, it increases the risk of invasive plant species becoming established and further spreading. It increases shoreline erosion, and removing plants decreases habitat for fish and can harm fish populations. So from these perspectives, it's really important to keep an eye on trying to protect those native plants in our management actions. So with that, I will wrap up, and if there's time, I can take any questions.
Great, thank you, Joe. I do have one question. I will say that a lot of people chimed in and really want to know about an aquatic invasive species. So some of those Eric was able to answer in the chat, but there was one specifically for you from the DNR was, what is the DNR's current stance on DASH versus chemical treatment?
Oh, so we don't have an official stance on it. I think, DASH versus chemical treatments, and really any management strategy, it's going to be depend on the circumstances, right? If you've got a lake that's entire, and so the circumstances, the main thing that I would think of is, what is the prevalence of the invasive species that you're managing, and what species are we talking about? DASH has a lot of benefits in that. So DASH is, for those that don't know, diver assisted suction harvesting, and you're essentially going out with a boat, and you've got a scuba diver that's got a little vacuum cleaner sucking up aquatic plants off of the bottom of the lake. The benefit, of course, is that you can minimize the use of you can be very targeted in which plants you remove, and you can minimize the use of chemicals. The downside is that it's expensive and time intensive, and it takes it potentially introduces more sediments into the lake. It increases turbidity to a small extent, and could potentially increase fragments of those plants that you're sucking up through these little vacuums, these dredges, being dispersed into the lake. So those are some things that DASH operators need to think about. So I would say in general, DASH is a good strategy when the plants haven't taken over a lake, when you've got just a few small patches. But once those patches get large, then you need to start thinking about other broader approaches.
Great, thank you. We need to move on to our next presenter, but I know Joe said that you'd be available for the rest of this the summit today. So if you have a question, I'm sure you can just shoot it to him directly in the chat, or his email is available there, and I'll have it at the end of the presentation as well. So we're going to move to our next presenter. Yep, thank you. All right, so I'm going to introduce our next presenter while we pull up his presentation. Roger Labin is an enrolled member of the Lac Vieux Desert Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Roger is a water resource technician in the tribe's environmental department with responsibilities including manoomin restoration for the tribe's ceded territory and water quality monitoring. He was inspired by his mentor and uncle, Nagonosh, who had a vision of manoomin returning to the traditional lands. Roger has over 38 years of experience and is a consultant and advisor on several manoomin research projects throughout the state and the upper Midwest. Roger is the current tribal delegate on the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative, and he co-chairs the Native Wild Rice Coalition. He was the recipient of the 2019 Michigan Heritage Award presented by the Michigan State University Museum's Michigan Traditional Arts Program in statewide partnership with the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs in the state of Michigan. He enjoys visiting tribal communities, schools, colleges, and conducts wild rice camps to share the cultural, spiritual, ceremonial, and traditional importance of manoomin. His personal goals focus on conservation, protection, restoration, and management of the limited resources in Michigan for the next 7 generations. Take it away, Roger.
Bonjour, Maneuven. Matiguinabe and Anishinaabe. Digo Duodem. Ojibwa Anishinaabe and Dao. KK Gitaganing and Lunge. What I said is, hello, good morning. And I announced who I was, my spirit name, Matiguinabe, which is spirit of the trees. I belong to that fish clan. I'm from the sturgeon clan. And I'm from that Ojibwa nation up on the western end of the Upper Peninsula, KK Gitaganing, which is land of the old gardens. And that's the French name from as of Lac Vieux Desert. But KK Gitaganing is the Ojibwa version of land of the old gardens. And I'm honored to follow Joe's presentation because a lot of things that I could have said that I don't have to say now was presented in Joe's presentation. And on this slide, you'll see Courtney Colea was a co-presenter. I prepared this presentation for the Keweenaw Ojibwe Community College and MTU students earlier this spring. And I asked Courtney to join me at that time. She wasn't available today. But the reason I needed to rely on Courtney was because I was recovering from a stroke. I've kind of completely recovered from that stroke. I think is the best that I can. The Creator has blessed me in that sense. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to go quickly through this because you're going to have this available to you. And again, some of these slides I'm probably going to go through quickly because of the limited time that I have. I could expand and I'll answer questions. But there is my contact information as well as Courtney's. When it comes to this, Courtney has been working with me almost a decade in my education and outreach programs. And then I welcome any and all questions. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do at this point is start out giving you a very brief understanding of where the Anishinaabe, which is that first people, as we come to Mother Earth. And in that picture there, you'll see that there's 4 colors, and that represents the 4 races. And those were the individuals that the Creator put on Mother Earth after he created Mother Earth and this universe. Mother Earth is only a part of this universe. And when the Creator created this universe, he created everything. And so in our teachings, everything is alive. Everything is a being. And by being, it means that they are of a spirit. We believe that, and what is communicating even in this presentation is our spirits. Our spirits, I'm speaking and you're hearing. And our physical body is how that spirit gets to go around Mother Earth and to do that work that we were put here to do. And when I say put that work that we were here to do, is we are to understand that Mother Earth does not belong to us individually. We were put on this earth to tend for, to care for, to protect, to preserve Mother Earth. In our teachings, we are taught that we have to maintain Mother Earth for the next 7 generations, and from 7 generations from there. Our goal is to keep Mother Earth, and as we leave, that our work is that we improve Mother Earth, that it was better than when we got here. But recently that has been really hard for the indigenous people to do that. I will say that much at this time. Next slide, please. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you was why wild rice is so important to us. And one of this comes from our migration story. Our migration story starts before the invasion of 1492. And on that map, you'll see that the Three Fires people were located in the upper right-hand corner there at the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And there was a woman, a Quay, that had this dream about a woman standing in the middle of a river, raised up out of the water, facing that western doorway. So she went to the spiritual leaders and asked for a interpretation of that dream. As a result of that, the Three Fires people and the spiritual leaders were visited by 7 prophets. What I'll share with you today is the first and third prophecy, those which each prophet came and gave a prophecy. And so the first prophecy said that we needed to move. We needed to leave our homeland at that point. And said if we did not move, we were going to face death and destruction. And so we also went into the third prophecy, which said we needed to follow that migas shell. It's that cowrie shell that grows in the water. We needed to follow that. And we needed to follow that shell where it was going to lead us. And we needed to go until we come to find that food that grows on the water. And that food that grows on the water is what we call manoomin and wild rice. There is no, in our oral history, there is no exact time of how long this took, but it was before Columbus landed. And as we left, we started going up the St. Lawrence Seaway. So our journey started at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And our journey ended on Madeline Island, which is on the western end of Lake Superior. And on that map there, you'll see a bunch of the arrows, but it took, the 7 stopping places. And each one of those represents a totally different thing when it talks about the 7 fires and the prophecies. But in that third prophecy, we left and we migrated. The Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi were the Three Fires people. And each one of those people had some responsibilities to keep those teachings alive and available for the next 7 generations. And so, as you see here, we did migrate up to the Great Lakes Basin. And if you understand the picture of Turtle Island, which is North America, and if you looked at North America as a whole, it looks like a turtle. And where that heart of that turtle is the Great Lakes Basin. And the Great Lakes Basin starts with Lake Superior and ends in and dumps into the St. Lawrence Seaway. But the Great Lakes Basin is the only place that manoomin grows. So it's a very, very important and sacred plant to us, because it is the reason that we, as Anishinaabe people, as Ojibwe people, are currently here. Because if we look at up and down the eastern seaboard, that was also inhabited by, Native Americans, indigenous people. How many people are remaining on that upper, or up and down that eastern seaboard? I don't say that much at this time, but there's a whole lot more that goes into this story. Okay, next slide, please. Maneuven. Maneuven is the interpretation of that is menu, which is good. Min is berry. And as the prophecies told us, it is an important, healthy staple food to the Ojibwe diet. And it's an annual aquatic grass, which grows, which is rich in protein and low fat. And actually, Laura and I will send you the flyer, which is later on in this presentation, of why it's so important to and the staple food for the Ojibwe people. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we call these beds are Manitugitagans, or spirit gardens. And we believe that this was a sacred gift from the Creator to us, because as we fulfill that prophecy, it also gave us the ability through the harshest of winters, that if we maintain two of these staple foods, one being the manoomin, the second being maple sugar, we didn't have that ability to leave our wigwams and go out and gather and hunt. We could still maintain and we could still survive. And manoomin was as it is for any other people or agricultural people. I mean, not only did the indigenous people gather through summer, from the time that the first berry comes, the strawberry, and as we start preparing for the winter. But the manoomin harvest was two of the things that, two of the times that it was, that these people came together, because the processing is so labor intensive. The other one being, the sugar bush. The sugar bush too, if any of you had make maple syrup, in tribal communities, they make both maple syrup and maple sugar. The second time, that's in the spring. The second time is in the fall, when they come and they harvest this resource, this manoomin. And these camps, I conduct camps all the time, and I invite each and every one of you to attend one in the future if you see a wild rice camp, to come and understand. And I'll share with you briefly how that happens later on in this presentation. But it is a daily source of daily nutrients, a gift given and cherished. And we start in the spring, and we honor this plant because it's an annual plant. It's not a perennial plant. And early on, manoomin played a key role in finding the tribal villages, because most tribes had even though they were nomadic, they always had a place that they would kind of call their traditional lands, which was normally near wild rice beds. Next slide, please. And the ecological importance. As Joe was talking about, one of the things that I wanted to stress is that the Aquatica palustris, the Aquatica, I can't how to say it, Aquatica, which is in southern Michigan, were very, very prominent in the state of Michigan as the state or the land became cultivated. But one of the things that Joe could agree on is that it's a keystone species. a species which contributes important services to an ecosystem. And the disappearance would drastically change the ecosystem. The health of an ecosystem and the inland river or lake can be gauged by the health of a manoomin bed. And in our teachings, it talks about manoomin being like the canary in the coal mines. The coal mines, when that canary was singing, it was safe to go. When they didn't hear him, it was unsafe. But wherever there is a manoomin bed, it means that that water quality, which I'll share with you a little bit later, is very, very pure. And the Great Lakes come from a lot of ground aquifers and from groundwater, as well as runoff and everything else. And as Joe said, it covers and it serves as a cover for a lot of these winged ones, the invertebrates, the amphibians, the muskrats. And one of the things that I think Joe, or for us, the rice bed itself also gives us a lot of migratory birds. And as in our subsistence living was another reason why the beds were, I mean, their reservations or homelands were important, as the muskrats, the beaver, all these other things. And the plants for the clarity, the turbidity. This plants helps with the filtration. And again, like Joe said, the algal blooms. And so what we consider is we are the land and the land is us. We live in balance with Mother Earth or the land. It's part of who we are. We are all connected and we all have a role to play in these ecosystems. Next slide, please. So the habitat that is required for wild rice is, a consistent, 6 to 3 feet, 6 inches to 3 feet of water, clear flowing water that can maintain steady levels during its early growing stages, which is include, for the nutrients, that the plant requires. Also, it increases turbidity. And water can fluctuate, but it depends at which time of the growth of the plant that it is advantageous to grow, and that's early on. And then later on, you can have some fluctuations. Well, water clarity, which is turbidity. And again, wild rice, even though it is very flexible and can withstand a lot of things, one of the things it can't compete with sometimes is the native vegetation, but more so the invasive species and minimum shade because of the clear, low turbidity. The plant also requires a lot of sunlight. And so if you could plant those beds where it gets the most sunlight would be great. And one of the other things that is very important is that it becomes a very organic, mucky, muddy soil, soft, because of the taproot goes down. And because it likes that, their secondary taproot makes it stable. Next slide, please. So in the Maneuven cycle, as I said, it's an annual plant. And so it's not a perennial plant. So these rice beds aren't always a given. It's not given that it's going to do. It is dependent on a lot of conditions. And so it starts in the upper left-hand corner when the seeds knocked or dropped off the plant. And it kind of starts its germination. And then after ice out, as the water starts to warm and the decreased oxygen, it stimulates that growth so that in April, May, it starts being submergent. And it grows, like 3 to 4 basal leaves. So then in May and June, that taproot in that, you can see where that floating leaf stage, this is where the rice is most susceptible because it is only held to the earth with that taproot until that secondary root system, which stabilizes it to allow that aerial plant to submerge, stand up and produce that seed head. So that in mid-July, when it starts growing up in that bottom left, those tillers and those aerials are going up and produces that seed that's up at the very, very tip. And that's the female part of that plant. And below that is the male plant. And the male plant flowers, first, and it usually flowers for about a week. And then the female starts flowering. And so this is another important part of the plant's life in pollination. And then my very last slide is a good example. I'll show you where the male flowering and the female flowering on the same plant. But this is a plant that depends on a seed bank. So it's not a perennial plant. So each plant only has a 1-year life cycle. Starts in the fall, it grows, and then it dies again the following fall. Okay, next slide, please. So some of the tools that, at least in the tribal communities, there are rules and regulations, and I believe not all tribes have it, but my tribe has it. And the traditional way and the proper way that we are taught how to do that is using these tools. In the lower left-hand corner, you'll see the ricing sticks, or as we prefer as knockers, because you actually are knocking the rice off that plant. The second thing you can see there is my friend Pete using a push pole. Even though it's on open water there, that's where we train them how to use this push pole. It is a way to propel the jaman, or the canoe, through the wild rice. That pole has a fork on the end of it, which perches itself on the secondary root system of the plant, so you can push that canoe through the rice bed. Next slide, please. So these are some of the other things that you would need once you're out. You go out and you harvest that wild rice, and you can see in that left picture there's Courtney's. She has painted her knockers there. She also has a paddle that you'll see in that, uses like in that middle picture, and then the moccasins that she uses in a jigging pit, which is another part of that process. And so after you harvest that seed or that rice, and you bring it in, you put it out to air dry for 3 to 5 days, and you try to get rid of a lot of that moisture. So then you put it to the fire, that plant to the fire. From that point, it turns from a medicine to a food, because you're removing all life. Water is life. So what you're doing is dehydrating that plant. And as you dehydrate that plant, preparing it for storage, you make that husk really, really brittle. And you'll see in that picture there, on the right, that's an Anishinaabe, which is a birch bark basket. And we use that to separate the seed from the chaff. Next slide, please. You can see Courtney there. She has, we have a pit. We put this in a hole in the ground, and we actually dance on it, or jigging it. And so as we, when I do this teaching, I kind of refer to everybody, especially the younger generation don't know about it, but the older generation, you can see in this picture, they can all relate to the chubby checker twist. But this dancing on that rice is kind of like the twist. And what it does is that action, you only do 1 foot at a time rather than both feet. It separates that hull, or that husk, from the grain. And then after we take it out of this pit, we put it in that birch bark basket, and we separate it. Next slide, please. In the one slide on the left there, you can see that in that metal bucket there, that some of the husks are still on that, on the rice. And so what you do is you go through that separating process. So you separate that and you put it back into the jigging pit, or you can roll that between your fingers and take that husk off and do that. But what we also do is we separate the long grain rice, as you can see in the bag, and on the right you have that broken rice. And that broken rice can be broken down into meal or flour, or the broken pieces, the bigger broken pieces can be used in soups and some other things. But the long grain rice is just used for popcorn rice, or there are many uses for the long grain as well. Next slide, please. So this is the flyer that I intended to send to Lauren before. And so what this does represent is the comparison of wild rice, brown rice, and white rice, and why it compares the two, and why it's such important, and was important to, and still is important to the tribal communities. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. If you really want to find out more about manoomin and how it disappeared in the state of Michigan, here's a good resource. It's a book written by my friend Barb Barton, and it's available online, so you can look for it. And it has an accent history of wild rice in the state of Michigan. Next slide, please. And as Joe was talking about, these are some of the threats to manoomin that we encounter when we do our restoration, and some of the things that we actually monitor when we do this monitoring, as well as monitoring. We actually do biomass. But these, we are trying to determine what impacts these conditions have on wild rice. Next slide, please. And so education-wise, these are some of the opportunities that this organization can do to help bring back manoomin into and bringing it back to where it would be available, not only, and that you can assist the tribal communities to bring this back and available to all people in your area. But the tribes are doing a lot of this, and they do need volunteers, just like your organization. The other thing that I encourage your organization to do is become involved with the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. And Lauren can answer a lot of your questions because she worked with me on a subcommittee and what we're trying to do in that organization. Lauren has got, or her previous employer had received some funding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lauren, but Lauren instigated, or not instigated, implemented a wild rice page link. So there are a lot of opportunities that you can assist and actually places that you can reach out and get assistance in doing restoration projects. Next slide, please. This is the one that I was talking about. This is in late July. You can see the male flower on the left, or almost center there, the red and yellow, which is below that seed head on, further on the right. And that female head, you can just see those little tufts, those little flowers. They're really small, but that's all it takes is to receive some pollen from that male flower. And I think I'm running a little late, so I'll take some questions now.
Thank you, Roger. We'll wait and see if we have any questions coming up in the chat, or if anyone wants to ask a question in person, please raise your hand. But I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative and kind of, how it came about and kind of how it's functioning now, because I know you played a big role in actually getting that started. So if you could elaborate
Well,
on that.
the short answer is I've been advocating for over a decade that the state of Michigan needed to address the wild rice issues. That I've been doing restoration work since the mid 1980s, and we've encountered a lot of problems, or even resistance from riparian owners that didn't totally understand wild rice. But Minnesota and Wisconsin have recognized wild rice, and in Minnesota, it's a state grain. There's actually even legislation being proposed in the state of Michigan that it's going to be recognized as a significant resource and a native resource to Michigan. And so the tribes were encountering a lot of hurdles in opposition to wild rice. And in the book, it'll tell you about some of the obstacles and why wild rice disappeared. But we needed to address it so that the tribal communities and the non-tribal communities could come together to do a co-management plan and do implement some harvesting regulations, restoration efforts to prevent GMO hybridization, hybrid species into restoration projects. And so Katie, her maiden name, I guess, was Cruz, but now it's Lambeau or Lambeth, can be reached at michigan.gov and talk about the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative and how you can, help the initiative accomplish some of its goals. We've been doing this for going on 4 years now, and we are going to be hopefully moving forward with a web page. We also got some funding to do our education and outreach to bring in other people and recruit people. But it goes everything from, like for me, education and outreach, showing and answering questions to the general public, to trying to take inventory, to try to change some of the laws, or consider changing some of the laws, like the water laws. And how can we manage? How can we, bring this back? How can we return some of these habitats to your community so that it would be a valuable resource to you? Because as in Joe's presentation, all those animals and more, even the migratory birds, the ecosystems that it creates has the potential to create on your lakes, individual lakes, are so important. But the state of Michigan is way behind Minnesota and Wisconsin, and you can Google a lot of their things that they go on in their community. But Michigan is coming in line with that.
All right, we do have a question in here, and I think this is probably a good one for you, Roger, since you travel all over the state doing this. Do you think that you can estimate how many acres of wild rice there are in Michigan?
Well, what we know of, and like I said, some of the tribes have not actually released some of their success into public documents, because again, as to the opposition and sometimes the abuse that those sites encounter. But I know, like right now, there are still only like 5 major rice beds, and no, 4 now, because the last couple of years, I say that is because we haven't opened up La Cruz there in the last 2 years, the harvesting, because that. But I would say that all the rice that out there would probably only be between 15 to 20,000 acres. But along the coastal regions, along the state of Michigan, that was just prominent, like in Suwannee, up there and around Saguenay, that was there, that could have been there in itself. But Tawas Lake right now is the biggest natural wild rice bed. And there again, they're encountering a lot of problems with the people with the chemical treatment, the vegetation harvesters, and some of the other things. So, But yeah, there is a great move by the 12 tribes in Michigan to do a restoration. But they need help, and they need volunteers like from your organization that can help. If you can help LTV, if you can help Grand Traverse, if you can, over at Tawas Lake or any of the other lakes, the tribes would welcome any assistance.
Yeah, and I would like to add along that note, because someone did ask about whether or not we have wild rice in this area. And what I will say to that is, backing up, I did work for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Vidau Indians for 6 years prior to joining the Watershed Council. And we did work on wild rice restoration. So I can say that we do have wild rice in our service area in some of our northern inland lakes. Right now, I don't feel like it's like I should be saying exactly where those locations are. I'm going to leave that up to the tribe as to whether or not they're comfortable sharing where those locations are. But we could definitely use help in identifying areas where there's rice that we may not know about. Because as you can all imagine, we have a lot of waters in this area, and it's really hard for us to be able to get to all of them. So if there's a way that we can provide you information with identifying wild rice so that you can let us know whether you actually have it on your water body, that would be of a lot of use to LTBB in helping to identify new areas of wild rice. So I hope that answers some questions on that. And then Roger, I wanted to know, there's a question here that I thought you could answer, is where can people find more information on attending a wild rice camp to find out how manoomin is processed?
The place that I do, well, the new website is definitely going to be there when it's up and running. But up until it's up and running, you can go to the Facebook page, Native Wild Rice Coalition, and all of the workshops that we do regarding education and outreach, I post on there. Unfortunately, we had to just cancel a camp that I had scheduled for the 9th through the 12th of September because of the coronavirus, peaking again. So the host Matiguinabe Indian community tribal leaders decided that they didn't want to be a hotspot and bring people into their community and share this. So there was a concern for safety for their community. But we will be doing some additional things because of the virus. We're hoping to do some virtual things about it, but there are just some things that you need to do face to face. You can do education, show pictures, but harvesting and doing some other things. Sometimes, when you are restricted to timeframes and that, you just need to have the ability, as in this presentation, you can only present so much and you only have so much time to answer questions.
Okay. All right, we have another question in here. Can wild rice be detected with video drones?
Yes, depending on what the capabilities of that drone. A lot of our research right now is done through drones because putting boots on the ground is so labor intensive and cost prohibitive that there is that spectrometry that certain cameras can identify wild rice, and it's even getting fine-tuned more. But I mean, there's people that are really utilizing it, like the Matiguinabe tribe. We're in the process of trying to get it, but we had to get a contractor to come out and do our potential sites to identify if there was wild rice there at all. And it can be identified through spectral ometry if you have that capability on your drone. You can, and I recommend it to the tribes to get it because you can even do estimates on your rice beds, and if you're doing a restoration project, the impact, and you can do some over time. You can see the developments and everything else. And Eric down at Anishinaabe would be one of the first people that can show you the impacts of how drones can impact and assist you in your restoration efforts.
Great, thank you, Roger. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Roger said that he would be available for the rest of the summit if you want to message him, and I will have his information available at the end of today. He's a wealth of knowledge, so I encourage you to reach out to him if you have questions. Feel free to reach out to me as well if you have questions. Caroline Keeson also used to work for Little Traverse Bay Bands, so we're very familiar with wild rice. And Little Traverse Bay Bands will be giving a presentation at most of our Watershed Advisory Committee meetings if you attend those. So if you want to join those meetings for more information. And again, feel free to reach out to the tribes because they are leading the charge on wild rice restoration. All right, so thank you very much, Roger. We are going to move on to our next presentation. All right, so our next two presenters, we're going to kind of do back to back and do questions at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first one as he shares his screen. So Eric Calabro is the primary technical staff for Inland Lakes under Michigan's Inland Lakes and Streams program. His responsibilities include program and guidance development on inland lakes issues and providing technical support and training on best management practices for inland lakes to internal staff as well as personnel from other state agencies and external stakeholders. He specifically provides statewide assistance on review of applications proposing work on inland lakes, such as dredging, seawalls, bioengineering, aeration, diver-assisted suction harvesting, etc. Eric also serves on the Interagency Aquatic Invasive Species Core Team in the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Lauren. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen good?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So my name is Eric. Like Lauren said, I'm with our resources program, and I'm going to be talking about aquatic plant permitting and best management practices as it relates to our program, specifically here at Eagle. And right off the bat, I want to differentiate between the program I'm in, which is the resource program, and the aquatic nuisance control program. There's always questions about, our lake wants to manage milfoil. How do we navigate all these regulations and statutes? So these different programs at Eagle are broken out by what statutes of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act that we cover. So my program covers the physical mechanical control regulations as it relates to inland lakes, streams, wetlands, and the Great Lakes. And the aquatic nuisance control program regulates the chemical control regulations. So that's how it's split out. So the Part 301 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act is one of the parts of that act that our program implements across the state. So this act regulates any kind of dredge or fill on bottom land of our inland lakes and streams, construction activities, and things along those lines. Anything that basically touches the bottom land of an inland lake or stream is going to be regulated under Part 301. And then same thing for Part 303. This is the Wetlands Protection Act, or I guess part of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. And this part regulates any kind of work done in wetlands. So I'm going to get some of this kind of regulatory permitting stuff out of the way and at the beginning of the talk here, and then dive more into some of the aquatic plant stuff in the second half of the talk here. So this is our main permitting kind of splash page for our permitting database, which is called My Waters. And this link here is live, so you can access this page if you like when this presentation is shared. But this is where you can go to apply for a permit. In order to apply for a permit, you do need to create a My Waters account. However, there's also a lot of other tools here that you don't need to create an account for. So if you see a potential spill or any other potential unauthorized activities, you can report it using this button at the bottom right-hand corner here, as well as if you're curious, whether somebody has a permit to do something or what's going on across the lake from you or whatever, you can use this Sitemap Explorer, which when you click this button, it's really like a Google map where you can kind of zoom in on this map at a particular area and take a look at all permitting and compliance activity that has gone on at that site. This is our joint permit application page. This is probably the most important permitting website that we have. It has a million links here, as you can see, with everything you could possibly want for permitting. Up at the top, you can see there's joint permit application instructions. We have a video on how to fill out the application. Our minor project and general permit categories, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, as well as a variety of links, including stuff on pre-application meetings, which I'll touch on here in a second. So these pre-application meetings are a meeting where you can meet with our district permitting staff to kind of point out stuff that might be a snag in your permit application when it's submitted. So it's basically to talk through a proposed project early on in the stage to kind of minimize costs and delays when you do submit an application. In Michigan, we have this kind of tiered permitting approach where the system is set up so that the level of impact reflects the extent of your project. So at the very lowest end here, we have these exempt activities under our program. And these are usually things like putting out a seasonal dock for private non-commercial recreational use, or a swim raft, or there's a handful of exempt activities that don't require a permit. The next step up are these general permit and minor project categories. So these are categories that are groups of activities where if your project meets the criteria in the category, it can be permitted at a lower cost and without public notice. So these categories kind of are the state's best management practices for certain activities, and have been shown to be able to minimize impact to resources if the criteria in each of these categories are followed. And there's a whole variety of activities. You can click on those links on the previous slide if you're interested, but really a lot of common projects are covered under these MPs and GPs. So if you can't design your project to meet one of these, it will fall into a public notice project where it will need to be public noticed and it's a increased fee. So that's my very brief permitting spiel, but if you have any questions, please shoot a note in the chat. I'm happy to elaborate on any of that. But I want to spend some time really talking about aquatic vegetation control. And I wrote down a few points for everybody to think about. In general, I think especially everybody in this group is aware that protecting our native plants in Michigan is really important. As Joe mentioned, they provide a ton of great functions and values to our inland lakes in Michigan. And I think a big goal of what everyone should shoot for is minimizing our impacts to our natives. We want to reduce our aquatic invasive species and really use selective control methods and reduced footprints to allow for exercising your riparian rights. Excuse me. So I kind of broke out some common aquatic vegetation control techniques here and broke them out with how they're regulated in the state of Michigan. So as I threw in the chat a little while ago when Joe was giving his talk, excuse me, I woke up with a sore throat this morning. Must be the weather change here or something. But I threw in the chat some a paragraph on different methods that are exempt from permitting, and those are cutting and kind of de minimis hand pulling of aquatic plants in localized areas are exempt. We do have a minor project category for diver assisted suction harvesting, which I'll get into in a bit. And really everything else is a individual permit, and I'll be diving into a little bit more of these later on, but I do have some pictures. This is a weed roller here, and diver assisted suction harvest, and then a harvester here as well. So diver assisted suction harvesting, this is, as Joe mentioned, this is used to control aquatic invasive plants, mainly your Asian water milfoil. We do have a handful of permits that we've issued in the state for starry stonewort as well. And how this works is you can see these divers here, they dive down with a suction hose. And what they're doing is they're pulling these aquatic plants out of the substrate first, and then just using that hose as a transport mechanism to get them up to the boat. So they're not using this hose as a vacuum on the bottom or as a dredging up sediment. It's only to transport the aquatic plants up to the boat. And these divers are taking care to remove all of the roots and rhizomes of the invasive species that they're harvesting, to ensure the effectiveness of this technique. So here's the other end of that hose. You can see these plants are bagged up on the boat and then disposed of in an improved location. So I kind of wrote down some benefits and potential concerns that that kind of go along with DASH. A lot of people gravitate towards DASH because it is a non-chemical method. Folks across the state seem to be trying to wean off their chemical load, and I think this is a good way that they could add to their arsenal of aquatic invasive species control. Somebody was asking about, is this a good replacement for chemicals earlier? I think, to be honest, I think it can augment chemicals, and I think sometimes in certain situations, as Joe said earlier, for smaller, more localized populations, it can be effective. But this DASH is really suited for these smaller patches. If you have larger scale, large acres of invasive species that you're trying to control, you're going to want to use multiple methods, and one of those may be chemicals. So another benefit of DASH, it is selective for the target species you're trying to control, and you're also removing the roots. We do have some concerns with DASH and ways to minimize impacts. The first main concern is the spreading of plant fragments. And this is especially true with plants like starry stonewort and Eurasian water milfoil that spread through fragmentation. And it's not just fragmentation when you're physically pulling up these plants, it's also during the bagging process and disposal as well. So as many of you here know, this is what starry stonewort looks like. Their reproductive structure here, this is called a bulbil. This is just a few millimeters across, these things are just covered this plant. And each one of these can potentially start a new colony. Same thing with nodes. They're just a few millimeters across and have the potential to start a new colony. So containing these is really important. You can see this containment of starry stonewort does not work. So this mesh is way too large on these bags. You can see the bulbils just pouring out. So it's really important to use a good containment method, especially when containing starry stonewort, Eurasian water milfoil, these plants that reproduce through fragmentation. Another best management practice that is required on all diver-assisted suction harvesting is the use of turbidity curtains, not only to contain turbidity, but also contain fragments. You can see this is a turbidity curtain that was not placed correctly. Turbidity curtains should be placed from the top of the water all the way down to the bottom. And I took this picture a couple years ago, and you can see the fragments just pouring out. Each one of these fragments has the potential to start a new colony of Eurasian water milfoil. So, it's really important to use these best management practices so you're not shooting yourself in the foot. You're doing a good thing, trying to control this aquatic invasive species, but it has the potential to really drift fragments all around the lake if best management practices are not used. So I already touched on this a little bit, but turbidity is another big concern that we have. Disturbance of sediment can suspend nutrients in the water column. It can, as Joe mentioned, it can affect fish eggs, can affect mussels, crustaceans, juvenile fish, can smother organisms. There's a whole slew of negative impacts that are associated with turbidity and sedimentation. So it really needs to be contained. You can really see the impacts of turbidity here. This is a properly placed curtain. You can see the turbid water here compared to the water outside of the curtain. You can see how effective these things are. And then usually what we require is this turbidity to settle out, and then that curtain can be removed. Here is another improperly set curtain. You can see this turbidity outside of this curtain. So when I pulled up to this site to do a compliance inspection, I immediately noticed this turbidity, and I also noticed that these invasive species here, this Eurasian water milfoil, was just pouring out of the corner because these corners were not attached together. So you can see all this Eurasian water milfoil here just pouring out of the turbidity curtain and being spread around the lake. So I was interested, so I jumped in the water as I usually do, and found that, here is that gap in that turbidity curtain where the invasive species were leaving the work area. And then this site was in about 12 feet of water, and these turbidity curtains are only going down about 8 feet. So there was another 4 feet there that were not covered by curtains, which is what was resulting in this turbidity leaving. And I want to show you what this looks like here really quick. So here is a improperly set curtain, and you can see this turbidity just flowing out of this curtain. And again, this is associated with a wide variety of negative impacts. So this turbidity really needs to be contained at all sites. This is why these curtains are required. And to touch on the fragmentation end of things, I started recording this video when as soon as this dash diver started working, and I want everybody to take a look at how many fragments are produced in just this 30-second video. So again, I just started recording right when he began dashing, because it gets too turbid to really record any video after that. But it's just astonishing at how many fragments are produced. There's a fragment here, there's one, there's another one over here. So these plants are built to fragment because it's one of their main reproductive strategies. So it's really important to contain these using proper BMPs. And again, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Dash can be really effective. I'm not trying to be down on dash at all. I really think in certain situations, if it's done right, it can be a very effective tool for controlling invasive species. But containing fragments, completely containing turbidity, leaving those curtains in, being able to identify all the species that you're working on, and then removing those fragments and disposing them and going through our decontamination procedures are really, really important. So again, we have our, we just recently modified our minor permit category for dash. We expanded it out to 10 acres per year and also included a few other things in there. That new category can be accessed at this link. And here's the things that are required to submit an application for that. So we're requiring a vegetation survey and photographs of the vegetation that you're pulling, where you want to do it, how much you're planning on, and whose riparian properties, riparian interest areas you'll be working on. So it's all very standard stuff that's required. If you want more information, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to send you examples. So really quickly, I know I'm kind of running tight on time, and I still have a lot of slides to go. So I'm going to try and breeze through some of these activities. All of the rest of these activities, an individual permit is required, and these are really not best management practices for aquatic vegetation control. So these, this first device is called an aqua blaster or muck blaster, or it goes by a variety of names. It can be freestanding or attached to a dock. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these devices. Basically, it's like an underwater oscillating fan that blows muck and aquatic plants and debris away from wherever the person wants to blow it away from, I guess. So I wrote down here some concerns that the department has with these type of devices. They're not selective. It's considered a dredge and uncontrolled fill. We've had issues with folks pointing these at their neighbor's property, for example, and piling up muck in somebody else's riparian interest area, impeding access. it's just not really a best management practices. I'm not going to read through all of these things here, but there really is a variety of negative impacts associated. So and especially the cumulative impacts of these as well is also something to consider. So same thing with these weed roller or eco harvesters and similar things like that. So these are rotating devices. This device rotates around in a circle like this, as you can see, and it has a twisting arm that pulls up the aquatic plants in this area. Again, this is not a selective technique. It can suspend sediments, have public trust and riparian rights issues, and we've had issues with folks putting these actually in wetland. So that's another large concern that we have, which I'll dive into in a little bit here as well. And it can interrupt fish and invertebrates and things. So it's definitely not a best management practice either. Same thing with dredging, rotivation. This is basically an oversized garden tiller that we've seen proposed to dredge up certain areas. So again, this is physical threat to organisms, obviously, destruction of habitat, and really not required in most cases to exercise your riparian rights. So, and then benthic barriers. This is another thing that can have negative impacts on invertebrates. It can there's research showing that can alter macroinvertebrate density and community assemblages. And really, something like this, I think the end goal of doing these kind of barriers is really restoration. And there's we've seen them for people creating swim areas and things too. But the department wants to promote the use of better methods to restore aquatic plant communities instead of just creating a vacant hole that's void of aquatic plants. So here's an aerial photo. We often see projects that want to dredge large areas that look like this. Here you can see a weed roller here. So we encourage folks, and really we're required by statute to look at feasible and prudent alternatives such as cutting or dock lengthening, so you can access the water in these areas. So this is both a part 301 and 303 permit is required where there's floating leaf and emergent vegetation in areas like this. So you really need to think about your project purpose and heavily document feasible and prudent alternatives that can accomplish your project purpose in your applications when you're working in wetlands and in our inland lakes and streams. So very quickly, I know I'm a little bit over time here. I'm gonna just close this out. You may be thinking, these muck blasters and weed rollers and lake mats, these are all really small impacts. Are they really that big of a deal? Like, why should I care? I just want to set out this small weed roller so my grandkids can swim. And I really encourage you to think about the cumulative impacts to your lake when setting these things out. And by cumulative, I mean, if everybody on your lake did this certain activity, what would that look like for your lake? And there's been some research done on this in Michigan, and what's been found is that lake habitat complexity, riparian vegetation cover, and shallow water habitat, we have over 50% of lakes in Michigan are in the most disturbed category for this lake habitat complexity, and other categories that are associated with submerged aquatic vegetation. So I really quickly want to show you what this looks like. This is Gun Lake. And here is what Gun Lake looks like, what it looked like in 1938. And we're going to be first focusing on this northern bay here. And so here's a zoomed in version. Here's what this looked like in 1938. You can see just by the texture of this photo, this is wetlands here surrounding this northern bay. And here is what it looks like, or what it looked like in 2014. So you can see this is really a huge difference. Canals are dredged, fill has been added, homes have been built. There's been a huge disconnect between the wetland and the lake here over just this relatively short period of time. 1938, to 2014 is one person's lifetime, hopefully less than one person's lifetime. It's 74 years. So, these are huge impacts, and all of this, I'm showing this back and forth. All of this didn't happen at once. This is slow incremental changes over time that caused these large, massive changes. So, and it's individuals just doing things on their property. So I really encourage you guys, please think about what you're doing on your property. I get questions a lot about, folks who've been living on lakes for 50 years or 60 years saying, the lake back when I was growing up on this lake was so much different. And I totally believe them, because how could it not be with that level of impact? So really quickly, I want to go through and just bring up some numbers here. So what I just showed you was a 48% of wetland area loss on Gun Lake over that 70-some year period. Over the entire Gun Lake area, in 1938, there was 52% of wetland shoreline, and in 2005 there was then 12% left. And then in that North Cove area in 1938, 99% of that was wetland shoreline. And in 2005, it was knocked down to just 13%. So this really causes a large reduction in these functions and values of our that we get out of our lakes and riparian wetlands. And I'm not going to go through reading all of these. Joe did a great job addressing all of these values earlier. So I just really encourage everybody to please exercise your riparian rights responsibly, and think about how you develop and work with your inland lake shoreline. So I'll try and get to any questions. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. We're going to move right into Ryan's presentation next, so I'll go ahead and introduce him while he shares his screen. Ryan Crouch is an environmental quality analyst with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy's Water Resources Division in the Aquatic Nuisance Control Program. The ANC program reviews and issues permits for aquatic plant and algae control using herbicides. Ryan has worked for the department for just over 5 years and has a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife from Michigan State University and a master's degree in aquatic ecology from Bowling Green State University. Over to you, Ryan.
All right, thank you. And thanks for Tip of the Mitt for organizing this event today. And hopefully it's really an informative one for everyone. And my name is Ryan Crouch, and I'm with the Eagle ANC program. And today I'll be talking about just giving an overview of the program and how permits are reviewed and issued, and also talking about how that fits into invasive species management. And so my presentation is going to have 3 parts. It's going to talk about ANC's role in aquatic plant management in the state of Michigan, an overview of permitting, and also how those, as I said, how those permits fit into invasive species management. And so the Aquatic Nuisance Control Program is within the Water Quality and Aquatic Nuisance Control Permits Unit of the Water Resource Division. And ANC permits for the use of herbicides to control invasive plant species, nuisance aquatic plants, and algae. And that authority comes from Part 33 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. And if you're more information on the ANC program can be found at www.michigan.gov/ANC. And ANC permits are written, as I said, to treat those 3 categories of concern and are issued to balance those activities with protecting water quality and aquatic life in the lakes or systems that the permit is issued in, and balance the protection of aquatic habitat and aquatic organisms with maintenance of recreational uses. And these permits are also issued on a wide scale in terms of geography and scale of water body, from lakes that are thousands of acres to small backyard ponds. So the permit program does have quite a wide range of scope in terms of what might require a permit and projects that need review. So it is quite a wide range of interesting projects that get sent in for review as well. And so these permits that we issue are also to support control of non-native invasive species with less restrictions on those activities targeting those species, and also to allow limited native species treatment with restrictions to what can be done in both space and time. And finally, to also ensure that treatments are conducted according to state law, the rules that have been developed by the department, and the EPA product label, which is a federal guidance document on how these products should be used. And then, so I just want to briefly touch on authorization to apply for a permit. And so what groups can apply for a permit or authorize a permit to be applied on their behalf? Those are individual property owners of groups of individual property owners. And this is where associations fit in, either by organizing individuals collectively to submit permission, or if the association owns the bottomlands of the water body. And also, if as opposed to individual property authorizations, there are two options for kind of large scale management by a statutory lake board if it's been established under Part 309, or a special assessment district established by a local unit of government that can provide a singular authority for managing a whole water body. And Eric already talked about the MyWaters database, so I won't go into too much further detail. ANC permits are also through this database. And so the application review process has a lot of factors. Some of them are the administrative review, which makes sure the bottomland authority is appropriate for what's being proposed, make sure all necessary authorizations have been given, and also make sure that the person applying has the appropriate status in MyWaters to be applying for a permit, and also make sure that fees, the appropriate fees have been paid. For individual and standard permits, there are 4 different fee categories that increase in the amount, the fee size corresponding to an increase in acreage size. And so smaller projects would have a smaller fee. And then after that administrative review is complete, it moves to the environmental review, where the water body characteristics are considered to make sure that the water body is going to be appropriate for the characteristics of the water body, such as the flow through the outlet or within the lake, is appropriate for what's being proposed as the treatment, and also the delineation of non-native and native species treatment areas to ensure that the native species proposal is in line with the conditions that limit native species on the permits, and that not too large of areas are being proposed for native control. And that relates to treatment area relative to the size of the littoral zone. We try to keep the littoral zone impact as minimal as possible, and so make sure that it's those native species protection conditions are achieving that. And for lakes that have a lot of shoreline development, this might qualify for more native species control. There may be need for additional conditions to ensure some additional protection for the littoral zone. And then we also consider records of threatened and endangered species, state conservation easements, trout stream or trout lake status, and wetland status on a water body to see if there are additional areas that need enhanced protections, or if additional conditions are needed or product restrictions are needed. And also we have records connected to the water bodies that if the DNR Fish Division or the tribal governments are interested in activities on that water body and want to provide comment. So for lakes and water bodies where that's been indicated, we have a agreement to send out for comment to the fish division biologist or the tribal biologists to gather their concerns and any additional data they can provide that would be relevant to the review. And so that's a quick jump through the permitting review process. A lot more detail could be said, but I'm limited on time, so I kind of want to move on. And I just want to briefly touch on AIS watch list species. I'm sure you're all familiar with the invasive species that have established a foothold, such as non-native milfoil, starry stonewort, curlyleaf pondweed, but there are also aquatic invasive species that are less established in Michigan, and the state agencies are interested in keeping them out and keeping them from establishing a foothold. So these species are ones that we want you to keep an eye out for when you're enjoying the lakes. And if you do think you see something, to report it, and so that we can have a rapid response program for these species. Most of these are emergent or floating leaf species. The two main submersed ones are Brazilian Elodea and Hydrilla. And those are important to look out for because they haven't been seen yet in Michigan, but they have been observed in some areas in Canada and also in the US Great Lakes states, getting closer and closer. And there's a lot of concern that they could really alter the systems if they did get in. So it's one we definitely want to keep. Those are ones we definitely want to keep an eye out for. And more information on these watch list species can be found by going to the invasive species website, which is www.michigan.gov/invasives. And the ANC role in AIS management is to assist in education and outreach by telephone calls that we receive or in the field when we're out doing surveys and people have questions, but also to coordinate with the AIS program and their biologists and the SISMAs that do a lot of these treatments in the rapid response program, and make sure that those permits can be issued quickly to address those watch list species in a very timely manner. And then, so now I'll kind of turn to sort of one of the main components of this talk, which is aquatic herbicide usage to promote native species and as a tool for invasive plant management. And so there are several major factors that can be considered when implementing aquatic herbicides as a tool in your plant management program. And those are product selection, application rates, and timing of treatments. And product selection is important because systemic herbicides such as 2,4-D, triclopyr, and Procelicor can target non-native milfoil while not impacting certain natives like pondweed species, naiads, and Elodea. And these products have modes of action that impact plant processes only found in milfoil species and species with similar internal structures, which would be the dicot plant group. And so they are selective because the processes they target don't impact the majority of aquatic plant species, which fall into the monocot group of plants. So it's an interesting and useful divide in how aquatic plants have kind of evolved differently, and that some of and so they are a great tool for removing non-native milfoil because that differentiation does exist. And also application rates are important. Invasives typically have been found to be sensitive to lower application rates compared to native species. In particular, this is true for non-native milfoil and curlyleaf pondweed. And so as an example, one of the permit conditions ANC has is offshore and undeveloped areas have lower maximum dosage rate for contact herbicides to specifically target invasive milfoil and curlyleaf pondweed. And timing of treatment can be important as well. The invasives often begin growth earlier in the season compared to natives. So early control treatments can target only those invasives and leave natives to grow in later. Typically, as an example, non-native milfoil will start growing a month or so before other native plants really take off in a lake. So they're establishing those early season monocultures and can be effectively targeted. And that opens up the littoral plant zone for native species to grow in and create an enriched community, and also to reduce the amount of area that's available for non-native species to grow back in later in the season or hopefully in future years. So those early season treatments can be very important in controlling non-native species. And so I talked earlier about the permit limits to protect native species and standard permit conditions that ANC has. And some of these are the major ones we have are native submerged plants and algae are limited to treatment of 100 feet of shoreline per developed parcel out to 100 feet or the 5-foot depth contour, whichever is closer to shore. And emergent and floating leaf native species are limited to a 40 by 40 foot swimming or boat dock area and 20-foot wide boat lane per developed parcel out to open water to allow for navigation. And undeveloped shoreline and offshore areas are limited to non-native species only. And so this is meant to allow for some limited native species treatment to create access areas and recreation areas on a lake, but also to provide larger refuges for native species so that they can continue to thrive in a lake and create those quality habitat areas for the aquatic species that need to use them, as Joe was talking about earlier, and also to maintain those lake systems that native plant species are such an important part in containing, such as maintaining turbidity levels and other water quality parameters. And so this has kind of been a very quick presentation, try to cover a lot, but one last thing I want to talk about is questions to ask about plant management when you're considering moving forward with a management program, just to really make sure that everyone's kind of thinking about what are the management goals. Is it just to manage for non-native species and try to remove them or control them as much as possible? Is maintaining recreational access a goal as well? And just to really be clear about what you want to be accomplished through the management program. And then what are the available options, physical control, chemical control, other options. There are many tools that could be considered. So it's important to step through and consider what may be available for your lake. And how feasible are these options in conjunction with what's available? What is something going to be a better or worse option based on financial cost or timing of treatment? Is one option going to be able to be done at a better time of year that's going to be less impactful for use on the lake, usage of the lake, or is the timing going to provide timing and financial may correspond with each other, where at a certain time of year it's going to be much more cost effective to conduct a management activity, and also logistics in terms of just manpower and workload of all of these options. What does the lake have the ability to put forward as resources to conduct these management activities? And then also what possible side impacts are there? How is the plant community going to change as a result of the management program? And what other uses on the lake might be impacted? Are certain areas of the lake going to be less available for recreation or more available for recreation, or after the program has been started? And these are, it's important to consider the side impacts before the program starts. And the answers to these questions are specific to each water body and group of riparians. And so it's also just important to talk with your neighbors and talk with your fellow association members and develop a plan and know what questions to ask your consultants and contractors when you're looking to see who is putting forward a bid or a plan to do the work that you want to be done, and making sure they're also considering these questions. And so this was a very quick presentation. And so if you have additional questions after today, you can contact the Aquatic Nuisance Control Program by email at egle-wrd-anc@michigan.gov, or you can call our general phone line at 517-284-5593. And otherwise, I'm happy to answer any questions, and Eric is happy to answer any questions you might have about his program as well.
Great, thank you both, Eric and Ryan. That was a lot of really great information, and I appreciate you covering that in the short amount of time I was able to give you. I do have a couple of questions that people had actually reached or asked about earlier that I'm going to ask first. Are property owners notified about treatments?
There is a notification requirement for treatments under an ANC permit. It's basically a kind of a two-step process. So there is a pre-treatment notification that goes out 7 to 45 days before any treatment's conducted. And that goes to any property owner that's within 100 feet of any proposed area of treatment on the permit. So for a treatment that's conducted by an SAD and a lake board, that's going to be a potentially lake-wide treatment, or in large portions of the water body, everybody on the lake is going to be notified if they're a riparian. And otherwise, if it's a smaller treatment that's just treating patches on the water body, you might not be notified if the treatment's happening across the lake from you, but you would be notified if your neighbors are getting treatment. And then on the day of treatment, the areas of impact are to be posted with what chemicals are used and what areas specifically were treated, and also public access areas on the lake are posted as well. And those postings should say what areas of the lake were specifically treated. So if you're, for instance, putting in your boat at the DNR launch, you can know, okay, the western lobe of the lake had some treatment done, so I'm going to try my fishing spots on the east side of the lake today instead. That to know which areas of the lake have been treated and what might, so you can avoid those areas if there's a concern. Because the plant management's going on in that other area of the lake.
Okay. Right, the next question is, does Eagle keep a list of suitable dash contractors available for hire in Michigan?
I have a list of every contractor I am aware of, so I can send you that list. So it's just every contractor that has done work in Michigan, for good or for worse, I guess. So I'll send them all to you.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, next question is, what do you guys, what level of effort do you think that lake associations should place on AIS that are already established versus the species that are on the watch list? Oh, you're muted, Ryan.
Sorry, I thought I was muted and then muted myself. Sorry. Okay, so I think it can kind of depend on how the species that already have a foothold are impacting the water body already. I mean, if they're monocultures that are huge nuisances that are basically really pushing out natives and really ruining fish habitat and impeding access, that needs to be addressed, obviously. So it may be hard to dedicate time and effort to looking out for those watch list species, but it is still important. Fortunately for these watch list species, through the SISMAs and through the AIS program, they do have more of an ability to do fund treatments themselves through grant money. So as opposed to the treatments for milfoil and starry stonewort, which because of the scope are largely funded by the associations and lakes themselves. These watch list species and the rapid response programs do have some ability to cost share for the treatment, so that may free up some resources additionally to address both. So if the foothold invasives like milfoil are a huge nuisance and a huge problem, you want to get those addressed. But at a certain point, if it's established and it's becoming part of the native community, it may be worth considering just doing some monitoring, making sure that it's really been integrated and may not be needed. May not need to be as aggressive if if it's behaving more like a native species at that point. Milfoil is tricky because sometimes on a lake, it will just kind of merge with the plant community and just be a normal member. But sometimes on a lake, can just spread as a monoculture and push everything else out. So I think that, generally it kind of depends on what those foothold species are doing on the lake as opposed to the watch list species, but it is important to monitor for the watch list as well, at least, and then, alert the state, because there are state resources right now to treat and remove those. And so it just kind of becomes well, as with everything, it kind of comes down to monitoring and making sure you know what's on your lake, and then going forward with what resources are available.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so I know that we do still have a few more questions in the chat, but what I will do is we will make a list of anything that we didn't have time to ask, and I'll follow up with the presenters to get their responses on those, but we are going to go ahead and move into our breakout sessions. We have 3 breakout rooms prepared today. You will have the option to select which one you would like to participate in. So I'm going to give you a quick brief summary to help you to kind of decide if you haven't already. So a box is going to pop up on your screen from there, and you should be able to select which room. So we have about 40 minutes for breakout sessions, which isn't as much time as it may seem. I ask that everyone be respectful of time and reiterate that we really want to hear from Lake Association members. So I will then give a 10-minute warning once time is up, and you will be forced back to the main room where we will wrap up. So it should be pretty easy in and out for you all. So again, please be respectful of one another as thoughts, ideas, and experiences are shared during these discussions. All right, so first one up is going to be Greenbelts, Tools, Tips, and Tumbles, a discussion about local Greenbelt initiatives highlighting successful strategies and less than optimal outcomes. What does it take to get riparians to protect, install, and maintain Greenbelts? Everyone can share their stories about what has worked for them and what has not, as well as what they believe are the key ingredients to any successful Greenbelt initiative. And this will be moderated by Jen Buchanan. Invasive species don't have to be a mystery. Share your talents and troubles with invasive species monitoring, education, and management. Learn from other lake associations, explore existing program, and identify individual and collective needs. That will be moderated by Caroline Keeson. Our conversations with Casey will highlight our new policy and advocacy specialist, Casey Cook, who will introduce herself and provide an overview on the Watershed Council's past and current local policy work. And then we will open up the conversation to learn more about the issues and initiatives that are important to your associations and to answer questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms and go ahead and select which one you would like to join. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope we have everyone here. I hope you all found these presentations and discussions valuable. I know we covered a lot of really great topics today in a really short amount of time. So a big virtual round of applause for all of our presenters. And I also want to take this just a second to, recognize all the lake associations and all the work that you all do on behalf of our waters. It's really, really appreciated. We couldn't do it without you. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentations, everything was recorded and we will make them available. We're going to be putting a link to our evaluation form in the chat. So please take just a couple minutes to fill this out because this is going to help us for our planning for next year's event. If you have any final questions, also go ahead and put those in the chat and I will be sure to follow up with our presenters and I'll make sure that there's a document available that has the answers to those questions too as well. If you attend any of our watershed advisory groups, we will be having some presentations at the end of this year for topics on Maneuven from the tribe, as well as a presentation on waterless boat cleaning stations. So if any of those topics are of interest to you, I encourage you to join us there. And we will be putting up a slide for contact information for all the presenters. If you need any of that information, if you want to reach out to anyone individually. Otherwise, that concludes our summit. And thank you all for coming. And we really hope to see you next year.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Lauren. Thank you. See everybody soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.